Illiterate. The word landed on the rooftop restaurant terrace so sharply that even the soft jazz drifting through the speakers seemed to fade for a moment. I was carrying a tray of sparkling water when I heard it. Not whispered, not muttered under someone's breath. Said loudly enough for everyone at the table to hear. Said loudly enough for nearby diners to turn their heads. The woman who said it was Victoria Hawthorne, the wife of one of the most famous billionaires in California. She sat beneath the glow of hanging lanterns, wrapped in elegance and confidence, wearing a cream-colored designer jacket that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Her friends laughed politely, the way people do when they're not sure whether something is funny but know they're expected to agree. I stopped beside the table and forced a small smile. "Would you like anything else this evening, ma'am?" I asked. Victoria leaned back in her chair and looked at me as though I were part of the furniture. "Maybe a dictionary," she replied. "It might help." More laughter followed. I felt dozens of eyes shift toward me. Some curious, some uncomfortable, some waiting to see whether I would cry, argue, or run away. But I did none of those things. I simply nodded. "I'll be right back with your order," I said. Then I turned and walked away. Behind me, the conversation resumed. Yet I could still feel their amusement lingering in the air. The evening sky above Los Angeles was painted with shades of gold and deep orange. The city lights were beginning to flicker awake below the rooftop. It should have been a beautiful night. For most people, maybe it was. For me, it was the fourth shift of a long week. My feet ached. My shoulders felt heavy. And I still had 3 hours left before I could go home. As I reached the service station, one of the other waitresses touched my arm. "Emma, are you okay?" she whispered. I glanced toward Victoria's table. They were laughing again. "I'm fine," I said. And strangely enough, I meant it. Because people often mistake silence for weakness. They assume that if you don't defend yourself immediately, you have nothing worth defending. They assume that if you wear a server's uniform, that uniform is your entire identity. Victoria Hawthorne believed she had me figured out within 30 seconds. She saw a young waitress carrying a tray and decided that was the whole story. What she didn't know, what nobody at that table knew, was that the longest stories are often hidden behind the simplest introductions. I picked up the next order ticket and took a slow breath. Across the terrace, Victoria raised her wine glass in celebration while her guests smiled around her. She looked completely certain of herself, completely comfortable, completely in control. And as I watched her from across the room, I couldn't help noticing something. The people who speak the loudest about intelligence are often the least prepared for the truth. By the end of the night, everyone in that restaurant would learn that lesson, including Victoria Hawthorne. The next hour passed in a steady rhythm of orders, trays, and polite smiles. I carried plates across the terrace while the evening crowd grew larger around me. The rooftop was nearly full now. Conversations blended together with the distant hum of traffic from the streets below. Glasses clinked. Laughter drifted through the warm air. To anyone looking from the outside, it probably seemed like a perfect night. Yet every time I glanced toward Victoria's table, I could feel the tension sitting there like an invisible guest. She was enjoying herself. That much was obvious. Every story she told placed her at the center. Every opinion was delivered as though it were a fact. The people around her nodded often and disagreed rarely. I had seen tables like that before. Wealth has a way of making some people comfortable and others cautious. As I refilled water glasses nearby, I overheard fragments of conversation. Private schools, luxury properties, international vacations, investment portfolios. The numbers being casually mentioned were larger than what many families earned in years. Then Victoria's attention returned to me. "Young lady," she called. I walked over immediately. "Yes, ma'am." She pointed toward a menu item. "Can you even pronounce this correctly?" A few people at the table exchanged amused looks. I recognized the trap instantly. It was not a question. It was a performance. I calmly pronounced the dish exactly as written. One of the guests raised an eyebrow, surprised. Victoria smiled anyway. "Well, someone has been practicing." More laughter followed. I simply wrote down the order. "Anything else?" I asked. "No," she replied. "That will be all." As I stepped away, I heard one of the guests lower his voice. "Victoria, let it go." She laughed. "I am only having a little fun." A little fun. I thought about those words while standing beside the service counter. Funny how people often describe cruelty as humor when they're the only ones enjoying it. A few minutes later, I carried another tray onto the terrace. As I passed a table near the railing, an older gentleman looked up from his coffee and studied me carefully. Not casually, not the way customers usually glance at servers. He looked at me as though he was trying to solve a puzzle. I continued walking, but when I returned several minutes later, he was still watching. His expression was thoughtful now, curious, familiar, as though he recognized something he could not quite place. I felt a small knot of uncertainty form in my stomach. Have we met before? I wondered. Yet nothing came to mind. The gentleman eventually looked away, but not before glancing at the notebook partially visible inside my apron pocket. It was a simple black notebook, worn around the edges, easy to overlook. Most people never paid attention to it, but something about it seemed to catch his attention immediately. His eyes widened for the briefest moment. Then he sat back in his chair, staring after me as I disappeared into the restaurant. For the first time all evening, someone else in the room appeared to know that there was more to my story than a server carrying plates across a rooftop. For the next 30 minutes, I could not stop thinking about the older gentleman near the railing. Every time I stepped onto the terrace, I caught him glancing in my direction. Not rudely, not suspiciously, more like someone searching his memory for a name he had misplaced years ago. The strange thing was that I felt a similar sensation. There was something familiar about him too, although I could not explain why. The dinner rush continued. Orders moved in and out of the kitchen. The city skyline darkened as the last traces of sunset disappeared beyond the horizon. Strings of warm lights reflected against polished glass and silverware. Around me, the restaurant remained lively. Yet beneath the surface, I could feel something shifting. Victoria seemed determined not to let me fade into the background. Each time I approached her table, another comment followed. Another small attempt to remind everyone who held power and who did not. "Be careful with that tray," she said when I delivered a bottle of sparkling water. "I would hate for you to have to sound out the warning label before cleaning it up." A few guests laughed again, not as confidently as before. One woman looked down at her plate instead. Another man busied himself with his phone. The mood was changing, even if Victoria had not noticed. I thanked her politely and continued working. That seemed to frustrate her more than any argument ever could. People like Victoria expected reactions. They expected tears, anger, embarrassment. Silence left them with nowhere to go. A little later, I stepped into a quieter corner near the service station to update my notes. I pulled the black notebook from my apron pocket and quickly wrote down a few observations. It was a habit I had developed years earlier. Ideas arrived unexpectedly, and I hated losing them. As I closed the notebook, I heard a voice behind me. "Excuse me." I turned around. It was the older gentleman from the railing. Up close, he appeared to be in his early 70s, with silver hair and thoughtful blue eyes. He looked at the notebook, then back at me. "May I ask you something?" he said. "Of course." He hesitated. "Where did you study?" The question caught me off guard. Most customers asked about menu items or directions to the restroom. Very few asked about education. "Why do you ask?" I replied gently. His gaze drifted toward the notebook again. "Because I believe I have seen that symbol before." My heart skipped. On the inside cover was the emblem of a prestigious academic fellowship, one that very few people would recognize. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then his expression changed. It was subtle, a widening of the eyes, a sudden certainty replacing uncertainty. He looked at me as though a puzzle piece had finally clicked into place. Before he could say another word, a loud voice echoed across the terrace. "Young lady." Victoria was calling for me again. Several heads turned. The older gentleman followed the sound and slowly looked toward her table. Then he looked back at me, and for the first time all evening, I saw genuine surprise on his face. It was the expression of someone who had just realized that the person being mocked in front of the entire restaurant was not who everyone thought she was. Victoria did not seem to notice the exchange that had just taken place. If she had, she certainly did not care. Her attention remained fixed on herself, as though the entire restaurant existed for her entertainment. I walked back to her table carrying a fresh basket of artisan bread. The older gentleman quietly returned to his seat, but I could still feel his eyes following me. He had recognized something. I was certain of it now. The only question was what. "There you are," Victoria said as I approached. "I was beginning to think you got lost." A few nervous smiles appeared around the table. Nobody laughed as loudly as before. The change was subtle, but impossible to miss. People were becoming uncomfortable. Victoria, however, continued forward without hesitation. "Tell me something," she said, folding her hands on the table. "Do you always work here? Or is this just a temporary stop before some grand career plan?" Her tone suggested she already knew the answer she wanted. Before I could respond, one of her guests spoke softly. "Victoria, perhaps we should talk about something else." She waved him off. "I am simply making conversation." Then she turned back to me. "Well," I offered a polite smile. "I enjoy learning new things. I suppose I am still figuring out where life will take me." It was the truth, just not the entire truth. Victoria laughed lightly. "That sounds like a very diplomatic way of saying you do not know." Around the table, several people shifted in their chairs. The atmosphere felt heavier now, not because of what she said, but because everyone could sense she was searching for ways to keep the spotlight on someone who clearly did not want it. I excused myself and walked toward the service station once again. As soon as I arrived, memories surfaced unexpectedly. Long nights, library lights glowing past midnight, research papers spread across small apartment tables, endless cups of coffee, years of work that nobody in this restaurant knew about. Most people saw the uniform and stopped there. They never wondered what happened before a shift started or after it ended. They never imagined that someone carrying dinner plates might spend mornings presenting research, afternoons studying data, and evenings earning enough money to continue chasing a dream. I opened my notebook briefly and reviewed several pages covered with handwritten notes. Tomorrow morning, I would be back at the university. In less than 3 weeks, I would stand before a review committee and defend years of work. Just thinking about it made my stomach tighten. Excitement and fear often feel surprisingly similar. As I slipped the notebook back into my apron, I noticed movement near the entrance. A group of distinguished guests had just arrived. Several managers immediately straightened their posture. One even hurried forward to greet them personally. They were clearly important. The older gentleman near the railing noticed them too. His expression changed instantly. Then he looked directly at me. This time there was no uncertainty in his face, only recognition. And as the newly arrived guests began making their way across the restaurant, a strange feeling settled over me. The night was no longer moving in the direction Victoria expected. The group that entered the restaurant moved with the quiet confidence of people accustomed to being recognized. There was no need for loud introductions or dramatic entrances. Conversations naturally softened as they passed through the dining area. Several managers greeted them personally. One hostess nearly rushed across the floor to escort them to a private section, overlooking the city. I noticed Victoria watching them as well. Her expression changed immediately. For the first time all evening, her attention shifted away from me. "Do you know who that is?" one of her guests asked. Victoria nodded. "Of course. Everyone knows who they are." There was admiration in her voice now. Respect. The same woman who had spent the last 2 hours looking down on others suddenly seemed eager to be noticed herself. I carried another tray toward the terrace and tried to focus on work. Yet something felt different. The older gentleman near the railing had not taken his eyes off the newly arrived guests. More importantly, he had not taken his eyes off me. As I passed his table again, he spoke quietly. "Miss Collins." I stopped. Hearing my last name caught me off guard. I had never introduced myself. "Yes?" I asked. He smiled gently. I knew I recognized that fellowship emblem. My pulse quickened. "You did?" He nodded. "I attended a lecture 6 months ago. Your research was mentioned during a presentation." For a moment, I simply stared at him. Very few people outside academic circles knew anything about my work. Fewer still would recognize the fellowship attached to it. "That is very kind of you," I said. "I am still learning every day." His smile widened. The truly intelligent people usually say that. Before I could respond, another voice interrupted us. "Emma." I turned. One of the restaurant managers was approaching quickly. He rarely came onto the floor unless something important had happened. "Can I speak with you for a moment?" he asked. I followed him toward the entrance. My mind immediately began searching for possible problems. Had a customer complained? Had I forgotten something? Instead, the manager looked unusually nervous. "There is someone here asking for you." I frowned. "For me?" He nodded. "Specifically for you." We stepped into a quieter hallway near the private dining rooms. Standing there was a distinguished man in a dark suit, perhaps in his late 60s. The moment he saw me, his face brightened. "Emma," he said warmly. "I was hoping you were working tonight." I recognized him instantly. Professor Richard Langford, one of the most respected figures in my field. My mentor, my friend. My stomach dropped. Not from fear, from surprise. Of all places, of all nights, I never expected to see him here. Professor Langford extended his hand. I have wonderful news, he said. Behind us, the dining room continued buzzing with conversation. But I had a feeling that before the evening was over, that conversation was about to change completely. Professor Langford's words caught me completely off guard. The selection committee finished its final review this afternoon, he said, his eyes shining with excitement. I wanted you to hear it from me before the official announcement goes public tomorrow. For a second, I forgot where I was. The restaurant, the noise, the long shift. Everything faded into the background. Emma, he continued, your research has been chosen for the National Academic Innovation Conference. Out of hundreds of submissions across the country, yours received the highest evaluation score. I stared at him, convinced I had misunderstood. Are you serious? I asked quietly. He laughed. I have never been more serious. My heart began pounding. Years of work, years of sacrifice, early mornings, late nights, countless weekends spent studying while friends were enjoying vacations and celebrations. Suddenly, all of it felt real. Professor Langford reached into his briefcase and handed me a folder. There is more, he said. Several universities have already expressed interest in your work, including 2 institutions that rarely recruit before graduation. I looked down at the documents, struggling to process everything. Meanwhile, back in the dining area, several people had begun noticing the conversation. The restaurant manager stood nearby, listening respectfully. A hostess stopped briefly while passing through the hallway. Even the older gentleman from the terrace had shifted closer, watching with a knowing smile. Professor Langford placed a hand on my shoulder. I told them months ago they would regret underestimating you. I smiled. You always believed in me more than I believed in myself. Not true, he replied. I simply recognized what was already there. At that exact moment, a burst of laughter echoed from the main dining area. Victoria's table. The sound carried through the hallway. Professor Langford glanced in that direction. Busy evening, he asked. I hesitated. Then I shrugged lightly. Something like that. He studied my face for a moment. His expression sharpened. Has someone been giving you a difficult time? Before I could answer, one of the managers approached nervously. Professor Langford, your guests are ready whenever you are. The manager's tone immediately revealed how important he considered the professor. Langford nodded politely. Then he turned back to me. Actually, I would like you to join us for a few minutes later this evening if possible. There are several colleagues I want you to meet. My eyes widened. Me? Especially you, he said. After tonight, many people are going to know your name. As he walked toward the private dining section, I remained standing in the hallway holding the folder against my chest. Across the restaurant, Victoria was still surrounded by expensive wine, expensive clothing, and people eager to impress one another. She looked completely confident, completely certain, completely unaware that the story she thought she understood was beginning to unravel one thread at a time. When I returned to the dining area, nothing appeared different on the surface. The music still played softly. Servers moved between tables. Conversations floated through the warm evening air. Yet I felt different. The folder tucked beneath my arm seemed heavier now, not because of its weight, but because of what it represented. Years of work. Years of believing that effort mattered even when nobody was watching. I slipped the folder into my locker and returned to the floor. The dinner rush was beginning to slow. Desserts were being served. Coffee orders were replacing cocktail orders. Across the terrace, Victoria remained at the center of attention, or at least she believed she did. As I approached with fresh coffee, I noticed several guests from neighboring tables quietly watching her group. Word traveled quickly in places like this. People might pretend not to listen, but they always listened. Victoria glanced up as I refilled her cup. Still here? She asked with a smile. I suppose persistence counts for something. Nobody laughed this time. The silence that followed seemed to catch even her by surprise. One guest cleared his throat and looked away. Another suddenly became very interested in the dessert menu. Victoria frowned slightly before taking a sip of coffee. For the first time that evening, her confidence seemed less certain. A few minutes later, the private dining room doors opened. Several distinguished guests emerged alongside Professor Langford. Their conversation was animated, excited. One of them, a woman with silver hair and elegant glasses, spotted me immediately. Her face lit up. "There she is," she said. Before I could react, she walked directly toward me. The terrace gradually quieted. Not completely, just enough for people nearby to notice. "Emma Collins," she said warmly. "I have wanted to meet you for months." My heart skipped. I recognized her instantly. Dr. Margaret Ellison, one of the most respected researchers in the country. Someone whose books were studied in universities across America. She extended her hand. "Your work on language cognition is remarkable." Several heads turned. Conversations slowed further. Dr. Ellison continued speaking without realizing the effect her words were having. "The committee could not stop discussing your findings. Professor Langford shared your latest paper with us last spring." I felt heat rise into my cheeks. "Thank you. That means a great deal coming from you." "You earned it," she replied. "Do not let anyone convince you otherwise." Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed Victoria staring. The expression on her face had changed completely. Confusion first, then uncertainty, then something closer to disbelief. She looked from Dr. Ellison to Professor Langford and back to me, as though trying to solve a problem that no longer made sense. The waitress she had dismissed hours earlier no longer fit the story she had invented. Around her table, guests exchanged quiet glances. Nobody seemed interested in laughing anymore. And standing beneath the glow of the rooftop lights, I realized that the truth was finally beginning to introduce itself. For several seconds, nobody said anything. The silence was not awkward. It was the kind of silence that appears when people suddenly realize they have been looking at the wrong picture all along. Dr. Ellison remained beside me, completely unaware of the storm she had just created. To her, she was simply greeting a colleague whose work she respected. To everyone else, she had just shattered an assumption that had been holding the entire evening together. "Professor Langford told us about your upcoming presentation," she continued. "The committee was unanimous. That almost never happens." I smiled politely, still trying to process the attention. "I am grateful for the opportunity." "You earned the opportunity," she corrected gently. "There is a difference." Around us, conversations had nearly stopped. Several diners were openly listening now. Even some members of the staff had paused briefly near the service station. The rooftop suddenly felt much smaller than it had an hour earlier. Then something unexpected happened. Victoria stood from her chair. Not dramatically, not angrily, just slowly. The confidence that had surrounded her all evening seemed less stable now. She approached with a smile that looked carefully constructed. "Well," she said lightly, "it seems we have all been learning new things tonight." Nobody responded. She glanced toward Dr. Ellison and Professor Langford before turning back to me. "I had no idea you were involved in such impressive work." I noticed the subtle change immediately. Earlier, she had spoken to me as though I were invisible. Now she spoke as though we were suddenly equals. Funny how quickly status changes some conversations. "Thank you," I said calmly. Victoria laughed softly. "You should have said something." For the first time all evening, I allowed myself a small pause before answering. "You never asked." The words were not harsh. They were not angry. Yet they landed with surprising weight. Several nearby guests lowered their eyes. One man nearly smiled into his coffee cup. Victoria blinked. Just once. Then she forced another smile. Fair enough. But the moment had already slipped beyond her control. People were remembering the comments, the jokes, the assumptions. They were connecting them to everything they had learned over the last few minutes. And unlike earlier, nobody seemed eager to join in. Dr. Ellison looked between us, finally sensing there was a larger story unfolding. Professor Langford remained silent. The older gentleman near the railing simply watched with quiet satisfaction. I realized then that I did not feel angry. I did not feel victorious either. Mostly, I felt relieved. Relieved that I had never allowed someone else's opinion to become my identity. Because the truth is that people can misunderstand your job. They can misunderstand your circumstances. They can misunderstand your story. But they can only define you if you let them. The city lights stretched endlessly beyond the rooftop. Somewhere below, millions of people were living lives nobody else fully understood. And standing there beneath the evening sky, I had a feeling the most important part of this night was still waiting to happen. The rest of the evening passed with a strange sense of calm. The tension that had dominated the rooftop earlier was gone. In its place was something quieter. Reflection, perhaps. People returned to their conversations, but the energy had changed. The assumptions that had filled the room a few hours before no longer carried the same weight. I finished serving the last few tables and completed my closing duties. Plates disappeared into the kitchen. Chairs were straightened. Bills were settled. One by one, guests began leaving beneath the glow of the city lights. Before departing, Dr. Ellison stopped beside me once more. "I expect great things from you," she said warmly. Professor Langford smiled. "The future is going to be very busy." I laughed softly. "I hope so." They wished me good night and headed toward the elevator. Several other guests followed, offering polite nods and congratulations as they passed. Some of them had spent the entire evening only a few feet away without knowing anything about me. Now they looked at me differently, not because I had changed, but because their understanding had. Near the entrance, the older gentleman who first recognized the fellowship emblem paused before leaving. "Never stop learning," he said. "The world needs more people who are willing to do the hard work when nobody is watching." I thanked him sincerely. Then my attention shifted toward the final table still occupied on the terrace. Victoria sat alone for a moment while the last members of her group gathered their belongings. The confidence that had once surrounded her seemed noticeably smaller now. Not destroyed, just quieter. Human. She looked up as I approached with the final receipt folder. For a few seconds neither of us spoke. Then she sighed. "I suppose I misjudged you." Her voice lacked the sharpness it had carried all evening. I offered a small smile. "It happens." She looked down at the table. "I spent most of tonight believing I knew exactly who you were." "Most people do," I replied gently, "until they realize they only know one chapter." She nodded slowly. There was no dramatic apology, no argument, no grand speech. None was necessary. Some lessons arrive loud. Others arrive in silence. I wished her a pleasant evening and turned away. A few minutes later, I stepped outside onto the quiet street below. The night air felt cool against my face. Los Angeles stretched around me in every direction, alive with possibility. I thought about the years behind me and the opportunities waiting ahead. I thought about every long shift, every difficult class, every moment when progress felt invisible. Then I smiled. Not because someone important had recognized me, not because a room full of strangers had changed their minds, but because I had never allowed their opinions to determine my worth. As I walked toward my car beneath the glow of the streetlights, I realized the most valuable thing I carried home that night was not the folder in my bag or the opportunities waiting for me tomorrow. It was the reminder that dignity does not come from status, wealth, or titles. It comes from knowing who you are long before anyone else finally notices.